Welcome to the Glass Room. Welcome to our events program. I'm Christy. I work at Tactical Tech. We curated this exhibition that you see here upstairs and downstairs. And this is our events program. It's happening here every night. We have events which allow us to kind of dig deeper into some of the issues that these exhibits raise, and also allow you to ask questions and join the conversation as well. And tonight, I'm extremely stoked to have two of my favorite writers. I'm totally fangirling out right now, but April Glaser and Alexis Madrigal. April has written at least 2 to 3 articles on every single thing that I'm interested in. So everything from election security to tech worker protests to new emojis. I read that one too. She's also the host of the If Then podcast on Slate. She's a staff writer at Slate. Her writing is featured in several tech publications. She wrote an amazing article in Logic about indie media. I encourage you to look it up. She also wrote an article about workers organizing within Kickstarter. So you should definitely check that one out as well. And her article in Logic was called Another Network is Possible, which I feel like could also kind of be an alternative or a subtitle for this event that we're about to have. Alexis is also similarly a polymath who's written about the big tech companies from a kind of human perspective, making it tangible, what they're actually doing to our society. So I really admire the way you make those things really tangible for the reader. A subscription to The Atlantic is well worth the price just to read his writing. He's at work on a book, I'm told, about the Bay Area and how it came to be. So stay tuned for that. When I met Alexis here on the opening night of the Glass Room, we were talking about the Korean War and immigration in the Bay Area, among a lot of other things. And we got to talking about how all the problems that we see with the tech industry right now, that they have precursors that we don't often talk about. So they have some unlikely precursors that I think you might also be talking about tonight. So I really hope they're able to help us figure out how the internet broke and maybe even how we can fix it. So please welcome Alexis and April. Thank you.
So I made April come here and do this with me. So
it's okay.
I have to lead here in this complex conversation. I think the thing that I keep thinking about as I've been working on this book is that 2016 really does feel like this major inflection point for everything around the technology industry, both for people inside the industry as well as critics outside of it. Something clearly, we recognized something was broken in the way that these systems, particularly around social media, were functioning. But of course, everybody kind of has their own personal timeline where maybe they noticed some of the elements of the badness that became recognized after 2016 election. So we're each going to do this, but let's start with April. Your personal kind of timeline of when you started to be hey, wait a second, things aren't working as I thought they were going to, or as I feel like they should.
Oh gosh, I did not know I was going to be asked that. Well, that's good. No, so I have been working before I was a journalist. I've only been a journalist for about 3 years, but before that, I worked on policy and advocacy around building a healthier internet. So I've been thinking about the internet as not a place as a place where a lot of work could be done to make it better for a long time. Including at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I came right after the Snowden revelations came out in 2013 or 2014, yeah, 2013, with net neutrality before that. But I would say that my first concern that the internet wasn't working for everyone was probably around 2006 when I started working on issues of access. Because I realized that a lot of people in my community, where I'm from in Nashville, Tennessee, weren't online, and that it was very expensive. And I started working with groups of people to build mesh networks around the country in different communities. And so I was really focused for many years on doing what we could to get people online. So that was kind of my first realization that the internet was kind of a privileged place for many.
Well, that's interesting. And I mean, I think one of the things that really shook me in the 2010s was a book by Natasha Dow-Schull. I don't know if people have ever run into her work, but she does work on like the design of gambling machines. And it's really, really, really fascinating because one of the things that she found is that, you imagine those people sitting there at like the slot machines and they're kind of like hitting the slot, hitting the slot, hitting the slot. In interviews, like she's an anthropologist, in interviews that she did with them, they're pissed when they win because all they're trying to do is hit the slot machine. Like that state is what they're trying to be in. And as I was sitting there like doing this on my phone, night after night, I'd be like, wait, what am I actually doing here? And I think there's actually a lot of similar feelings that come around. I mean, they're not necessarily good feelings. It's almost like a lack of feelings that come when you're just like doing that night after night after night after night.
Reduces boredom.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it reduces everything. Like kind of nothing is happening, but time is passing, and somehow that's something people want sometimes, at least. And then I realized, like, wait, but like these systems were designed for sociality, supposedly. These systems were designed for people to communicate, to make the world more open and connected, and all these other things that we hear. And so then I've been thinking a lot about my pre-social media experiences of internet sociality. And how many people here were like on the internet before there was Facebook or Twitter? All right, this is my audience right here. All right, like how many people here were for BBSs? Anyone to go on BBSs? Yeah, all right.
Bulletin boards.
Even bigger, and I just started thinking about how we talk about this thing called social media, but when I really thought back on my like internet life, there were forums that I participated in all the time. Mine was an embarrassing one about UCLA basketball, but don't judge me. I had all these friends I didn't know on ICQ, like people that I would like communicate with. There were all these people on Instant Messenger, from my high school and people I had met like through time. And I was on a bunch of different email lists, like spanning kind of everything, from when I was like a little kid to when I, was in the workforce. And I started thinking, like, wait, what is this bullshit? Like that I'm like, you're giving me a social life on the internet? Like, but wait, my entire time on the internet is spent communicating with people already. And I think that really changed for me kind of the trade-off or the realization of the trade-off that we were making with some of the platforms. It's not like they were giving us email. They were just giving us like this slightly more convenient email. They weren't giving us like, sociality. They were giving us this like slightly more convenient sociality.
Yeah, I felt that way too. I remember I was one of the last of my friends to get on Facebook because I was already so online, and primarily through various like activist forums. So like indie media, which we can talk about later, through a lot of email lists, through message boards, and I just didn't feel like I needed a separate corporate platform in order to be online together with other people. But I also very much, as I said from the outset, realized that was a very privileged position, or it was a position that not everybody necessarily was in, no matter where your economic space was or how you got online initially. So I knew that the internet was already kind of a smaller place, or I thought of it as a place where not everybody was, but where I hoped more people could be. But I agree, I saw Facebook as kind of this strange thing. And in the same way, a lot of people might see Slack as like an IRC with a lot of window dressing, if you're familiar with Internet Relay Chat, which was just like an early way to chat with people online in a group.
Actually, I do want to talk about indie media, in part because I guess what I'll do is I'll do kind of like the pocket history that I think most people have of sort of how we got to the basics of internet culture. And I think that it would run kind of through the valley in this thing called the Homebrew Computer Club, and some of the people who kind of turned away from military work after the Vietnam War and turned away from like big networks of computers to personal computers, ones that you could control yourself. In fact, Stuart Brand, comes up with the term, or at least popularizes the term personal computer, which at that point would have seemed crazy to people because they were largely associated with the military,
When did he
IBM,
come
and
up with that
corporations.
term?
Why or when?
When? Yeah.
I think it was in like 74, 75. And Homebrew Computer Club starts down in Palo Alto. kind of started by activists. There were peace activists. There were free speech movement activists from up in Berkeley, and they kind of like intermingle and hybridize with a lot of the people who were working in what basically at that point was military-funded Silicon Valley. You have people working for semiconductor firms who are selling most of what they produce to the military, and you also have all the electronics companies who grew out of military work around radar and Stanford. And so you have this kind of like funny mixing of things, but what everybody can kind of agree on, particularly in the shitty 70s, was that like nothing could be trusted. Like no institution could be trusted. Like the government, like if you think about what just happened with the government, right? You've got the Vietnam War, which of course all these people think is a terrible idea, and in fact was. You've got the Cold War, so you've got all the possibility of apocalypse going on all the time. Then you have the Pentagon Papers come out, which say that every administration, Democrat and Republican, was lying our way deeper down the road into war in Southeast Asia. Then you've got the OPEC oil embargo, and you've got lines for gas. Then you've got the economy is kind of sputtering. So all these things are happening, and everyone just kind of goes like, well, it's just us. We're just going to like build this thing. There's no trust in institutions, higher authorities. We're just like these kind of individuals who are out here, and we need to we don't know what's going to work, but we're just going to kind of keep talking to each other, and hopefully something better will emerge. And that sort of gets channeled through the kind of cyber libertarian ethos that most people I think of as like sort of like maximal free speech. And into what you see, around stuff like Twitter calling itself the free speech wing of the free speech party in the mid 2000s. So that's kind of the pocket one. I think that's like a pretty conventional history. There's clearly it leaves a lot out of what happened, but I think a lot of people would be like, oh yeah, that's EFF, cyber libertarians. Tech utopia, and then you get the Web 2.0, and then the platforms that we kind of have now.
I have a question though, and I want to get into cyber libertarianism and kind of what defined what a healthy internet is today, and that can I think help us go back to the animating question that you started with, which is when did we realize things weren't going well? I don't know what happened in the 80s though. So you're saying that in the 70s there was this post-60s, post-Vietnam War, can't trust any institution, we're gonna start building computers. What happened in the 80s?
I mean, I think there's a few things. I mean,
in the 90s we got online.
Right.
Okay.
Well, the computing industry happens in the 80s, right? So people are, and the personal computer is a fairly like convivial tool, right? You can change it, you own it, you can like make it do all these different things. It's like fairly friendly for people to approach, and it feels like it's kind of distributing power away from these large institutions which had previously controlled computers. So kind of what people are building is really this sense of winning, that like, oh, we started as these just weirdos in a garage. I mean, literally, the first homebrew computer club meeting is in a garage. Then what comes out of that is Apple, right? So these people are going like, dang, we're onto something. Like we're kind of winning. And the other sort of trail that people, a guy named Fred Turner at Stanford has traced this really well, from counterculture to cyberculture, is his book on this, is the way that Stuart Brand built a thing called The Well, along with like Howard Rheingold and a bunch of other people, that became kind of a massive early BBS that was very influential in defining the way that people would end up seeing the internet. And just like, I actually just read this in one of my colleagues' amazing piece on the R relationships subreddit. But they only banned like 3 people in 6 years. So they took an approach to free speech that was pretty maximal there on the Well. And it, it's centered in Marin, is a very particular population that is like on the Well. And that idea of kind of like white male individual free speech is the most important thing kind of pops through a lot of the different internet strains, because those people, John Perry Barlow is like on the Well,
Right.
A lot of the people who are defining the way that we would end up.
People who started Sun Microsystems, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, so many people that you look into that were kind of internet pioneer type folks, there you find that they lens through that social network in one way or another. I want to ask you about the other network that is possible though, because if you haven't read this article by April, it's truly amazing, and I don't want to like steal any of her lines, but the idea is that there was like another path that could have been taken, another that wasn't really cyber libertarianism, but was kind of another sort of utopianism, or maybe not utopianism, but another form of another set of ideas that the internet could have been built atop.
Yeah, everybody started to get online in the 90s, and people had computers, and all kinds of people were getting on the internet and were using the internet to reach communities that they weren't able to reach otherwise, and it was allowing for transnational and global communication. And it was a really, really exciting time. In 1996, so EFF, where I used to work, they do a lot of incredible work around defending the internet, particularly against government surveillance. EFF started in I think 1990 or 91, and then a few years later, one of the founders of EFF, John Perry Barlow, wrote the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace.
In Davos, by the way. I didn't
In
realize
Davos,
that's where he wrote
Switzerland,
it, which
of
is
all
amazing
places.
and hilarious.
Which really gets to kind of perhaps some of his motivation there. But I'm curious, who here has heard of or read the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace? I know about half people here. Okay, so it's really a foundational document that kind of defines, and has still been used to define and kind of act as a North Star for what is a healthy internet, or what what we should build towards when we're building an internet.
I'm going to do a dramatic reading in a second. Keep talking.
Okay, but that same year that this foundational document, as more people were getting online, he wrote this kind of screed that said this is what we should be striving towards when we're building the internet. It's a very individualistic vision, or one that is very much about, not necessarily individualistic, but about preserving individual liberties online, making sure that you can have maximal free speech, you can do whatever you want, that no one's going to stop you. And Alexis might read this in a second, but at that same year, another person who had a vision for the internet, Subcomandante Marcos, I did not say that right, I'm sorry, I've had a long day, in Chiapas in Mexico, who was leading the Zapatista movement down there, fighting, kind of organizing farm workers to fight various policies under NAFTA that were where the government was forcing people off their land and appropriating land, and it was a bloody, deadly fight for the government against farm workers. And they were using the internet at that time to get the message out about what was happening to them, because it wasn't being published in the media. And they were sending mass email blasts, they were on forums, they were in bulletin boards, they were just letting everybody know however they could, really depending on the internet, like what was happening to them, what injustices were happening. And that really helped to spark an anti-globalization movement, a movement against kind of the harms of corporations being able to expand wildly without regulation across national borders, and the harms that could cause, without labor laws or without environmental protections. And so they were organizing online, and he called for a conference of other people who were engaged in this kind of early anti-globalization movement to come to Chiapas, and he presented another vision of the way the internet could be that was very different from the Barlow one. But before I get into that, do you want to read
Maybe
a
we
bit
should do
of
it.
this?
Yeah. I mean, just so you get a feel for it. For those of you who know what it is, I mean,
It's
you know
a
what's
very
coming.
dramatic.
Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one. So I address you with no greater authority than that which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear.
This was a very inspiring document for people who went on to found.
I mean,
some
I
of
was
the
like
most
very young, and I was like, yeah,
So
you know,
you were inspired by it.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
So people who went on to found some of the most important companies on the internet today, and I still see it cited regularly as a point of inspiration for people who are building massive platforms and are thinking through what the internet should be, what the built internet should look like as they're building and developing on it. Eric Schmidt has quoted it. Wozniak quoted, everybody, almost anyone who's made a lot of money off the internet has referenced this as a as kind of a guiding light.
They've just updated it. I address you only with the authority with which several $billion always speaks.
Right, and that articulation from the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. I mean, I can say this in hindsight. I was, a kid back then, but that kind of ethos where you're building the internet to maximize for individual liberty, as a place where individuals can be most free, where people can say whatever they want and do whatever they want, has terminated into a very corporatized internet. Into a place where free speech, as we learned from Mark Zuckerberg at his talk in Georgetown recently, is like the guiding principle. And of course, like, not everybody gets to enjoy the same rights in practice equally. We'll get into that in a moment. But what I was saying with the Zapatista vision of a networked world, they were arguing for and building a movement to organize the internet around communities, right? And so not around individuals, where we're trying to maximize for our individual liberties, but instead organize the internet around the health of communities and the needs of those communities as those communities are actively dictating those needs for themselves. So he imagined, and not just him, but the movement imagined building an internet that was kind of a network of networks, where people could, build hubs, and those hubs could be connected to other hubs, and be actively kind of working to serve their information needs as they built those hubs, which is very different than a place where like each individual gets online and then is their fullest self.
Well, and one of the things in your article is that indie media, in fact, built this.
Yes,
to some extent. I mean,
yeah. So in 1999, there was the WTO protests in Seattle, super violent. That during those protests, the first indie media website was born. In a few years, there were about 150 websites that all sprout up. Indie media was a kind of a. Does anyone here know what indie media is? Hey, Inku. Okay, indie media is a. I don't know, how would you describe it? Was. Still kind of.
Indie media was sort of a network of independent media cooperatives,
Yes.
mostly centered around the globalization movement, but also sometimes, focused on other sets of issues. And it kind of was a publishing platform and a community organizing tool.
Yeah, it was. Every city had its own indie media. There were many all over the world, and each city's individual indie media was connected to every other city's individual indie media. There was a main indie media site that shared stories, and the idea with indie media is that anybody could be a journalist. And so that's actually how I got my start with journalism, is journalism as an indie media person. But I would write articles and stories for the Nashville, Tennessee indie media, where I'm from. And it was this idea of open publishing. It was probably the first, or one of the first, most usable open publishing platforms online. And it was organized around this idea of liberating communities, or having communities define themselves. And it just got really big really fast. It's not really around anymore. But it's an idea that shows us, not just an idea, but a history that shows us that there's another way the web could work.
What do you think happened to indie media? I mean, and so many of the other independent media efforts.
Yeah, because you're also talking about all these other sites that you used to use that were not platformatized, that were not corporatized, and where you would organize and congregate online.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to think about this recently. Like, why did so many of the things that I love just like kind of wither and die, while the things I didn't love became ubiquitous across the entire world?
I think investment is a huge.
Yeah, I know I do.
that?
I mean, I think it's investment. I mean, I also just think it's, well, I think that when I think about Facebook's path, most specifically, it's that they created an engagement machine that could actually like take on television. And I think that they were able to start like carving attention out of all the many hours per day that every American watches television, or that Americans on average watch. And that's like the newsfeed. I mean, they figured out a machine that could show you what was most interesting to you more effectively than anything else and anything that anyone had ever experienced. And I think they did a really good job of that. I think for me, the problem is that at the very core of it was a deep emptiness. Like all of these things, right? There wasn't actually a purpose to making people more open and connected. And the question for me in a lot of this research is like, why could people believe that? Because people, you see online, people are just like, Zuckerberg, oh yeah, making people more open and connected, like that'll work out well. And to many people, it feels obvious that would not work. But to many people that I was around in the 2000s and around like Web 2.0 and all those things, that was not an obvious thing. Perhaps it should have been. But I think we were kind of, and I didn't build any social networks. Maybe I shouldn't even we this here. But I did believe some of these things at that time. So I don't want to take myself out of it. But I think that we were resting on more or less a very like market-ish interpretation of information and a kind of meritocratic digital space where it felt like, the received wisdom was essentially that the best ideas would sort of rise to the top in one way or another. And that idea has such deep roots in American thinking. It's actually crazy. I mean, it goes all the way back to like Mill, basically. John Stuart Mill says like, the best way of evaluating ideas, whether, it can kind of catch on in the marketplace. And then Oliver Wendell Holmes takes it up to decide some cases. Brandeis takes it up to explain some decisions. I mean, this thing goes like really deep into...
Ideas catch on in the marketplace if they benefit the marketplace.
Well,
too.
And that's kind of...
So this
right.
is what we saw happen here.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think that's fundamentally the thing. I also think that it generated a lot of really weird effects because if you think of, the kind of Milton Friedman thinking about how a market really works, isn't that like the best product gets produced? It's that all people's different preferences are satisfied by the same like productive system. And so if you think about a lot of the things that have gone on online, one of the weird things is that everybody does get their own little piece of the filter bubble, but then those things get like the highest engagement content is when you cross one person over here who's been reading only these publications with one person here who's only been reading those publications. And the shortest way I have to sum this up is like everyone is someone else's screenshot. Like on Twitter where people screenshot and are just sort of like, I'm screaming, or they just screenshot it because it's just like so obvious that's a terrible thing to say. I always like to think for myself, I'm that for somebody out there. It just keeps me humble. I'm just like, there's somebody watching the live stream who's like, this fucking asshole, and that's, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind about why the internet feels the way that it does. It's not just that you're in your own little pool, which actually was the case, much more the case before social media. It's that those pools get crossed strategically by the platform algorithms to generate really high engagement content.
So one thing I want to bring up to backtrack a little bit is something else happened in 1996 too, and that's the passage of the Communications Decency Act. Who here, I keep asking, but who here knows what the CDA is a little bit? Okay. So it's taken a shape that it wasn't really expected to take, but still it was kind of formulated and protected and has kind of become what it is because of those who were invested in the CDA. The Communications Decency Act is a law that was passed in 1996 that essentially, to really overshorten it, says that internet platforms are not liable for what people post on them. And that was very, very important for the creation of an interactive internet. Because, in order to invest in a website, people had to know who were building this website or were throwing money at it that they weren't going to get like their asses sued off because of some wild thing someone posted, and then they would get this big defamation suit. So it really kind of protected and insulated the internet and allowed it to grow into what it is today, and allowed people to throw millions and millions of dollars at it without fear of being sued. Now, however, we have an internet though where these platforms are not liable for what happens on them. And so, yes, it did spur a lot of investment. It also, some could argue, kind of created this lack of liability or lack of legal responsibility or collective responsibility that would kind of, push another corporation to do more. So it would kind of force Facebook to be more responsible for what happens on its site.
That's a really good point, and I think it ties into like another one of, I think, like the really deep roots. That's kind of the problem here, because they didn't have legal liability in the way that you're talking about, it kind of enables scale. Because for me, scale, I've started to think of it as kind of like labor leverage. You have like all this like borrowed labor you're getting from like user-generated content, and then you have this really like small number of people who are working for you, and that can work really, really well. But like other kinds of leverage, there's like risk built into it that people don't necessarily see very well. And so some of that risk showed up in all the sort of moderation problems. And I think you could say, I mean, Facebook has more or less like admitted that they like heavily underinvested in enough labor to actually sort of moderate the platform even in some way. And the only reason that people could do that was that more or less they like weren't that worried about it.
Facebook was more concerned with giving as many people a voice as possible, getting as many users on as possible, getting as many customers on as possible, if we want to rephrase that, and less concerned with making sure that the communities that use the platform were doing so safely and without being harmed. And part of that is because they had no legal responsibility to do so, and part of that is also because of the ideology that went into building so many of these platforms was around elevating individuated speech as opposed to giving communities a safe place to flourish.
Do you have any other routes we haven't touched on? I have one more, but I'll give you the chance to go first, like something that you think is like a highly significant piece of sort of the problems we've gotten into.
No, let's hear what you have to say. I'd love to talk about, what do you have to say?
Well, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about is that, once you have all these platforms sort of centralized and you have people looking at sort of one timeline or one set of timelines, and you've encouraged all these people to post all the time, I mean, it requires some sort of like algorithmic system to show them something, if it's not just going to be like reverse cron. And the system that basically everybody landed on was virality. And what that has ended up doing, like it's really interesting because for a while I've gotten really interested in like cybernetics, the kind of like 1940s and 50s, thinking about like the features and kind of general rules for sort of networks of communication and control. And it's interesting because there's kind of two main kinds of feedback. There's like negative feedback, which sort of like tends to homeostasis, right? So like if the temperature goes up, it tries to push the temperature back down. Positive feedback is like a totally different kind of thing. It sort of adds fuel to the fire. So like the classic example in cybernetics of positive feedback is, in a room like this, if we all started talking to each other, as long as you're sort of below the threshold where people don't have to start talking louder, then everyone can kind of hear each other. The second you hit the threshold where you have to start talking louder, everyone starts talking louder, and then suddenly no one can hear anything. And you've been in that restaurant. You like know what that's like, right? Basically, everything that the platforms did, and I actually think they did this a little bit unintentionally, was like all adding more positive feedback into the system. It was just positive feedback at every level. At the like individual post, there's just like, well, if this post is doing well, let's make it do better. If this person's getting popular, let's make it more popular. And what I think they didn't anticipate was how the media, because I think we play a huge role in this, would reform itself to add its own positive feedbacks in. Like, oh, that kind of media company is doing well, let's do more of that. That writer's doing well, let's have them train the other people on how to be on the internet. And so what you have is this system of information now that's all geared towards like doing more of the thing that just happened.
It's a pylon.
It's a pylon, yeah. It is truly bad, I think. And one of my, this article I referenced earlier about our relationships, one of the things that's so funny is I've kind of had this as a theory for a while, and then she profiled this woman, Anne, who's like in her 50s, lives in the California mountains, and is kind of the lead moderator of this subreddit. And her policy essentially for maintaining civil discourse is just delete as much as you can. Like she basically is like, what you need to do is put dampers on the system at all times. Dampers including you get banned if you post outside the subreddit about the subreddit. So they don't want extra attention. If a post starts to like move around in the internet, they lock the comments on it. It's an amazing system of adding negative feedback, and now it's considered to be one of the more humane places that you could post about a relationship on the internet. And I saw this same thing with like Ta-Nehisi Coates' old blog at The Atlantic. The comment section was so amazing, and his policy was basically delete everything. And I think that like there's just something to be like, just, you know, at a certain point we got to be pragmatic about this and say, like, you know, having all these different kinds of spaces, some of which might be like free speech maximalists, fine, and some of which might be the total opposite, are actually necessary to maintain that sense of like community norm that would be better in my...
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about, you know, the importance of Facebook, Facebook is important because it's a place where people engage in political speech, they learn about the news or the things that they need in order to vote meaningfully in a democracy, right? Or maybe to have a social life, or to have family life, or to connect with people. But you know, when we think about the places that make politics possible, those places really need to have a lot of rules in place, you know, because or else those who, if you let everybody speak, then some people are going to be threatening others, and it's going to be unsafe for some people to be there and speak freely. And so without rules about what you can and cannot say, or how you treat people, then not everybody will actually be able to speak freely. And we've seen this play out with hate speech around the world, and we see it, you know, play out in so many different ways. But I think that the Reddit example is really interesting because it shows how guardrails or rules, especially if they're consented to, because you wouldn't join this if you didn't consent in some way, and I'm sure there may be a place for them to input or argue about these. It's really important for the functioning of a community. I'll also add that the way, something we talked about before we sat down here, or before we turned our mics on, is that, you know, the way Facebook operates, or the way these platforms operate, is often that they are governing without transparency. And when you govern without transparency, it's a spectacle. Because all of a sudden it's like, oh, we have these rules and we're applying it this way now, but we applied it another way in the past. And like it's just not coherent. And it becomes, everything's just a massive media moment because nobody saw this coming, or everybody saw it coming, and it's just all absurd. And there's no history.
Right, it's not, you know, the David Kaye, who's like the UN's like special rapporteur. Right, yeah, right.
Very
Thank you for
cool.
saying that for me.
Yeah.
I
like saying that.
yeah, he says basically like Facebook isn't generating any case law, basically, and so they're trying to take these rules they have, which function like laws more or less, and like apply them. And they do it all the time, but they're not generating any body that can be that can be looked to, that can be understood, that can be argued about. You know, it is. And I really, you know, the weirdest thing is, you know, like Monica Bickert, who like runs their policy team, is kind of like the head of that moderation pyramid. Like, I do think these people are now. It seems to be women at most of these companies that are now trying to like clean up the mess around this, all the toxic speech online. And she's one of them who I feel like is really thinking about it hard, but is fundamentally constrained by some of the core beliefs of embedded into Facebook. And they're just like, where does it end? You know, I mean, I think they've got to be looking at content moderation and basically saying like, we're either going to keep hiring basically an infinite number of people, and then we're going to hope that that machines can do their job as soon as possible. But like, I see a future. I mean, this is my prediction. I see a future where at some point, if Facebook remains the way that it is, they should have like more people dedicated to the maintenance of the site. That's like the maintenance of the sociality of the site, which is content moderation, than they do building the thing. Like, why wouldn't they have that?
For the purpose.
Yeah. And what I would want to see too is like, why doesn't someone from content moderation, why aren't they like in the executive ranks? You know, why hasn't anyone been promoted out of like the content moderation shops up high in any one of these companies? Like, if they really take it seriously, which you should, then why aren't we seeing that reflected in the kind of in the institution as a company? Particularly because, for fuck's sake, they're generating the data that they're going to train the machines on. Right. Shouldn't they care about the data quality? Shouldn't this be something that every social network feels like is the number one most important thing about their core competency? I mean, to me, it seems totally insane.
They're funded by trying to, if the idea is to try to make as much money as possible, then they're gonna, you know, they're not trying to.
They're not trying to hire and empower people on the line.
So they want to build a functioning product that's not going to shut down and hire as few people as possible to do so, and not one where it would take a lot of like intensive community moderation. Something else you said that I thought was really fascinating is the idea of one set of rules to apply to like a global speech, you know, and the way all the communities around, like the idea of one set of rules to govern every community online in the
Think
world.
about it,
It's just bizarre.
I mean, sometimes when I think
Yeah.
about it, I'm like, 2 billion people are supposed to like have one 3-ring binder that like governs everything that goes on. You're just like,
That none of us can see, really. We
I
only get
mean,
a sketch.
I do. Like increasingly, I find it like that like the problem may just be like the raw centralization, not like the scale per se, but the centralization of that decision making in that way.
And this gets to, so yes, like
And we're going to questions
and
in
like a
minute.
minute. But I
Yeah.
just want to say that, like, back to a couple things I want to touch on before we open to questions is centralization versus decentralization. Talking about how the internet didn't have to be, or the way it is now. I mean, yes, we have this incredibly like platformatized internet where we only go to maybe 3 websites, if we even want to call them websites anymore. These walled gardens that are just overgrowing themselves like scary overgrown office plants. Like they. The internet didn't have to be this way. Another early vision of the internet was one that was very decentralized, where various communities hosted themselves, had their own servers, and were maintained by the people that used them and maintained by the communities that used them. And so the idea of like a more decentralized internet would be you're a member of a social network that you're invested in, and the person or the company that's hosting it you believe in, or it's of interest to you, and it's just not one massive platform. It's not like one like entirely corporatized space. Another thing I want to touch on, though, unless you have a comment on that.
No, go.
Is the beginning of, in the 70s that you brought up, the people who were defining what ethical computing was, or were starting to think about why would we want to live in a more networked world, and what we would build to make that happen, and they were obviously very politically minded. They were workers. And they were very much people who were building these systems and who were organizing, like Computer People for Peace, or many of the other groups that you've brought up.
Computer professionals for social responsibility.
Exactly, yeah. Really, these groups that were saying that we do not want our labor power to be put towards building nuclear weapons or to be put towards military use. And we're seeing that again today. And I think it's really, really interesting. And that the people who I think have the strongest lever of change to pull around correcting these platforms, like I don't think we're going to see a policy intervention anytime soon, because that would literally take an act of Congress, and that's not something that happens very often or easily. And it's a very complex thing to tease out too legally. But what we're seeing is workers actually organizing to using their labor power, saying we don't want our productivity, which is what is making these companies profitable, to go towards our 8 hours a day or 10, 12 hours a day, to go towards building platforms that are conduits for hate, that are making elections awful, that are reinforcing dangerous stereotypes or discriminatory practices. And so I'm very, very interested, again, in how labor can redefine, the people who are building the internet can redefine what they're building. So I wanted to say that too.
Okay, and then we're going to go to questions. So the last thing I want to say before that is tax policy.
Tax.
I mean, this is clearly like a massive. I mean, if you were to think of something that is kind of really tightly interwoven with the rise of personal computers onward, it's just like that. The system has started to get really good at creating billionaires. Some of that is scale. Right? If you've only got 55 people when you sell your company for billions of dollars, all of them are going to get rich, and so some of those things are true. And if you just look at like where some of the work by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, like you look at now, it's kind of like the top 400 people are really where the wealth keeps getting that slice keeps getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And it's really like the top 400 people now are like running away with it. And most of them, let me not say most, the people at the very top are the tech people, which is a big chunk. And there's just lots of different things you can do. And Saez, who's been studying this stuff for a long time, and Piketty in France and these things, the question they have is basically, how do you develop a wealth tax in the 21st century? Because what else are you going to do? Like, if you want a more equal society, like my father-in-law is a tax lawyer, and I'm like, you agree in principle that if you want a more equal society, there's not a lot of ways to do it once you've redistributed the money up rather than like taxing it back out, right? But it's going to be really tough, and his point is that wealth is even easier to hide than income, particularly for people who operate on a global scale and are totally wealthy and can spend $1 billion avoiding paying taxes on $100 billion, So Anyway.
You know these companies jump through massive hoops. I mean, you all are familiar with the fact that Amazon doesn't pay federal taxes, is essentially kind of worked its way out of that, and that the offshore holdings of these companies are just in the hundreds of millions of dollars in islands and holding firms and in Ireland around the world to avoid paying taxes, so that would ostensibly pay for public schools or what have you. And the other thing I want to say is that with the labor thing, I don't know if you guys are familiar, but just in brief, I bring that up because some of you might not be aware that, like, for instance, workers within Google, within Microsoft, within Amazon have been organizing for change within these companies to get them to end their contracts with the military, their oil and gas contracts, and to form a more ethical enterprise. And they're not organizing in the traditional way we think of labor organizing, which is to perhaps have worker protections, although that's a big part of it, and they're also organizing because they don't want to be building things that they consider to be bad. So, but yeah, taxes, labor.
All the fun stuff about technology that people love. Yeah, let's do questions. Yeah.
Do you think it would make a difference if they did either seriously had the executives spend a week doing content moderation? Because from my understanding, most of them are contractors that are at the kind of off-site places. And if they literally had to spend one whole week doing it, do you think it would shape them differently? Or to your point, do you think they also need to bring them in as employees into the firms and have them sitting next to these executives?
The latter is definitely something I would say rings true for me, in that they should not be considered contractors, but should be considered an integral part of the workforce and treated as such and respected as such, and get all those benefits and perks that are so famous for this industry. The first thing that you said about about executives working in content moderation, building empathy is always a good thing and can definitely help a lot, but it doesn't necessarily change the position that you're in or coming from, especially if it's so momentary. So taxation is really important, and putting structural things in place, as well as checks and regulations that force them to be better, because even though they might have build a deeper understanding through that experience, I wouldn't trust that it would change anything.
I think, one quick thing I'll say about the outsourcing, which I think is so interesting. So when do you guys think the first electronics companies started to outsource to areas of East Asia? Like what year?
Contractors, yeah.
Yeah, or just, contract manufacturing in East Asia. It started happening in the early 1960s. What's wild is that tech, Fairchild Semiconductor, right? So there's Shockley, Fairchild, and then the semiconductor industry, more or less. And Texas Instruments, fine. But here, this is kind of what it looks like. They're leaders in moving all of these things to Hong Kong, Malaysia, and other countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And it was actually part of our basically imperial policy towards East Asia. I mean, we had their actual governments that the document has produced, which says we would like to develop these nations as essentially export-oriented nations to tie them closer into the American sphere of influence, to sort of act as a bulwark against communist China and Russia. And so we basically set it up so that this would work this way, that we'd manufacture things there and these things would come to the US. And now you can look right here that this is where we've gotten with that, right? If you look at this, this thing, and of course on the other side of it, we kind of liberalize immigration from East Asia, and the people who end up doing the electronics manufacturing in the Valley, tons of them are immigrants from Latin America and Asia also. So the industry, which got famous for its sort of HP was famous for its management by walking around, is kind of the famous phrase about how they manage their company, also had tons of these people working who I guarantee you were not experiencing management by walking around, and yet their stories were completely ignored. There's been a few, I just want to mention two great books in the history of Silicon Valley by two awesome historians. Margaret O'Mara's The Code is extremely good and gets into these issues, and also Leslie Berlin's The Troublemakers. She runs the Silicon Valley Archives. She's an amazing historian down at Stanford and basically they do all the things that fail as I am saying, but much better. So you should read their books.
Always been labor that hasn't been looked at. Okay.
Hey, so I'd love y'all to like touch on something. You spent like 30 seconds on it, and I'd love for like to unpack it more on like the centralization issue of like, is centralization the fundamental problem, or if we just get the right people in the Tech Workers Coalition, or like the right kind of regulation or policy, like a reformist versus an abolitionist, it's kind of like.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't go into it thinking that I was going to find centralization to be such a huge problem. But the more that I've thought about it, I kind of think it is. And Reddit just provides a really, really interesting counterexample because it's sort of federated, I guess you would say. And I didn't realize this, but like Reddit has gotten bigger than Twitter, and most of its.
When you say federated, I just want to.
I mean, like they've got some rules that govern everyone, but then each subreddit is kind of governing itself in other ways too. And I just obviously, it's hard to say that because some of the worst shit is on Reddit, you know what I mean? So it's hard to be like, this is a great example. But it at least kind of shows that a sort of more Galapagos kind of setup where more things can evolve in different ways and into other kinds of things, the answer might be there somewhere, is kind of what I've been thinking about. And it may be also in that version of the system. Like, I don't think you'd be able to get rid of social media companies at this point without breaking them up. But you could do that, but you wouldn't like get rid of them. You just multiply them. And for a long time, I thought like, is that any better? And I don't actually have a position on that in any real way. But like, if there are 20 Facebooks, or even you really do it more realistically, maybe there's like 10 or 12 or 15 or 17 networks that you could find out there. Is that a better world? It's something I've been asking myself a lot, and my initial answer was no. And I don't know that I've changed my mind yet, but it's really like I'm working it through.
Well, all I'll say on this is that accountability is usually best achieved locally, right? And in smaller groups where we can actually like call to power and know what that power is, and have a more communicative relationship with power. And so it's hard to do that at such scale. So when I think about breaking up Facebook, I mean, right now, clearly this company is so powerful, it can decide what we see and don't see, who we talk to and don't talk to, whether we're on it or not, what information is percolated to the top and what isn't. And that's just a tremendous amount of power when it reaches this many people, when it fundamentally acts as like a global broadcaster. And so limiting that power is one way to reduce the harms. And so, yeah, I'll just stop there. But localism is generally more accountable. And localism, of course, means smaller than global. So, hi.
Thanks for the conversation. It's been really great so far. To what extent do you think the accessibility of some of the technology is still to blame? Like, if I want to make a better Facebook, I have to code still. The tools to make something like that are not available to everyone. They're still strictly in the hands of engineers. And even as an engineer, I'm still beholden to the large companies because even if I'm going to make something, I'm going to host it on Amazon or on Microsoft or something like that. So like, is there a future in which the basic building blocks of making these technologies get accessible enough that anyone could make better competitors to these platforms?
Homebrew Facebook Club.
No,
Yeah.
I'm so happy you bring this up. Actually, first of all, Kenichi runs iNaturalist, and it's one of my favorite platforms for citizen science and cataloging and learning more about plants and birds and animals. And it's really fun. So respect for that. But I will also say that there's this idea largely forwarded by Lawrence Lessig that code is law. And of course, if code is law, as you're saying, then it's a fundamentally undemocratic regime because not many people can code. And so that's a problem. And if we are depending on code to create the systems that we're operating in, then it's not going to be very democratic or usable. Something completely unrelated or unexpected to say to that is that I'm very interested in things like Blockly. Does anyone know what that is? It's like a program actually from Google, but it allows people to learn to code and to build coded environments, to build software, not using text, but instead using like modules and like putting things together and using blocks to put it together. It's like a sandbox to build in. And there's a lot of really cool innovation happening right now that's looking not at writing code, like some language with all these weird apostrophes and parentheses that are really confusing, even if you know what you're doing. But instead, think about kind of like using objects or like blocks to put it together. So there is a lot of work going into, I don't want to say democratize that process, because democratize doesn't mean make available to everybody, which is what it's often pretended to mean in the tech world, but to open that up into a more accessible way.
I'm going to answer this like slightly differently, which
Yes, 'cause that was so far out.
no. My answer is, I promise you, even weirder. People here know Ted Nelson. He is like kind of like a famous '70s computer theorist. I'm just going to use just put everything about Ted Nelson over here. I just want he had a term called fantics, which was his idea of if you want to talk about radio, it's the whole complex that makes radio, not just the tower and the way that radio receivers work, but also the time slot and the kind of cultural things that get built in and around these things. And I think for me, less than wanting people to know how to code, it's that's one layer of sort of the fantics of social media. And it's all these other things around it that developing more familiarity with pro user level stuff of these of the tools that already exist, because you could do lots of different things without really having to know how to code. You would just have to come up with new ideas about how to use the pre-existing things.
And the fetishization of engineering in terms of what goes into building a computer program or software or platform is actually pretty toxic, I think. And I don't know how we use the word toxic, but it's something that I think is troublesome, because there's a lot that goes into that should be equally and more valued, not more valued, but just as valued in the building of computer programs, like thinking through how people are going to use it and how people are going to behave on it, and also watching people use it and then responding to those needs to make it even better for them. And the design, there's so many communicative components to building these things that that should, I think, be at level with the structural engineering of it.
I just, last thing I'll say about that is I think I think it actually is extremely technically difficult to do the things that people are doing now. And I think that because of that, it feels like such an incredible achievement to have done it. And I guess I want to have some sympathy for that too, that just you can see how if what you're doing feels like the hardest possible thing and you're putting all your time into it and it's so hard, that if you get the thing working and you keep it working, that what a seductive feeling that is. And so anything that says the thing that you got working isn't working quite right is actually very threatening. And I think you also see that reaction within the tech lash as well. And I think it's quite reasonable, even if I don't agree with it.
Long answer.
Maybe one more? Maybe one more?
One more question from the audience.
Thanks. You were talking about employee protests, and I think at some point, just like the banks were too big to fail, I think some products, they will give a little bit to employee protests, but they won't fundamentally change their system, like Facebook being one of them. I think if a lot of Facebook employees walked out, Facebook wouldn't change that much. So going forward, how do you kind of incentivize companies to analyze the social risk of their product as well as the financial risk, and incentivize them, more importantly, to actually listen to those studies? I was wondering if you had any ideas on that.
Yeah, no, I think there's a few, I'll give you a few thoughts that maybe are related to that. I think one thing I've been thinking about the worker protests, which are really, really, really interesting, is I think that it's kind of pushing the companies in two different ways, because there's certainly, as some people are organizing inside, other people are organizing to oppose them and are becoming bigger cheerleaders within those companies than they might otherwise have been. And I just think that's going to be a really fascinating thing to play out, because sometimes I think like, oh, we're like in the worst possible world, and then I'm like, oh no, it could be worse. Like there is the internal kind of feeling that a lot of people have of Facebook of kind of like, oh, are we doing the right thing? I don't know. Are we doing the right thing? I don't know. Becomes like, yeah, we're doing the right thing. And all these people out there, like forget this. Like it could actually, the company could filter that way and have more employees that look and feel and act with that as a norm. Yeah, I guess I feel like workers, they need to get a lot bigger. But I think they could change some fundamental things about the way the companies run.
I don't think. Well, first of all, one of the things that is considered scarce here is labor, and that's why they pay so much for it. And so when labor starts to leverage that, I'm very interested in what could happen. And we've already seen. Google changed some of its employee policies, particularly around sexual harassment and around its contract worker treatment of staff. It also generates very bad press that runs counter to the narratives that they very much have floated on, that have allowed them in many ways to be buoyed without regulation for so long and appear to be such a friend of like kind of a left, or like a friend of the Democrats, and now they're starting to, that reputation is starting to tarnish, and I think that reputation has been tremendously profitable and tremendously important for them to keep up. I have no, I can't really project into the future that much, but I do think that people should organize to build the world that they want to be in, and so I think it's fascinating, and I will continue to watch it. We did see Google drop military contracts, like with Maven, for example, and they reportedly, or they said, abandoned their work with Project Dragonfly, which was to build a censored internet in China. So, we've seen things change, or a censored search, I should say. So I'm curious to see what will continue to happen.
But to your point, those aren't their also. I take that point, and also it's not their core product, right? They're willing to give on things where they can, or where it doesn't feel worth it.
One thing that's interesting, just on that, lastly, I'll say, with the Mark Zuckerberg speech at Georgetown, I'm so fascinated by that, because he was arguing against his critics, saying, we're going to champion free speech, and everyone else is telling us they want, moderation. They want us to take stuff down, but we're going to do the hard thing and champion free speech. And he said specifically that people who want us to take stuff down want this in favor of their own political outcomes, which isn't true. People who want him to take stuff down, at least from everyone that I've met as I've been reporting on this for the past 2 years, want him to take stuff down because it's hurting communities, not because they have some political agenda they're trying to forward. And I'm very interested in if they
just fully buying the the right-wing line on it, like hook, line, and sinker. Yeah.
So if they are going, if Facebook will be filled with people who believe in the ideology that Mark Zuckerberg was professing on stage at Georgetown, I don't know, that they certainly could just hire people that agree with him, and that's one way to keep things intact, and that's really unsettling. Yeah.
I think that's our time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just
Thank
want to
you,
thank
guys.
Alexis and April for that talk. Thank you so much.